everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Brittany Hicks. I'm one of the co-founders of Fayetteville Road, and we're excited to do another interview for Green Enterprise, which is a weekly series dedicated to the latest in cannabis. And in honor of Women's History Month, we have Chenae Bullock joining us, and we are very excited to connect with her today. So thank you, Chenae, for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I feel really honored to have been thought about.
Oh my gosh, of course. We cannot talk about cannabis and inclusivity without discussing the opportunities that you've educated us on in the industry. And so I'm really excited to have you here today to talk about all of the work that you're doing. So if you could get us started by just sharing a little bit about your background, who you are, and all of the efforts that you're driving.
Yes, so I am a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. The Shinnecock Nation is located in Southampton, Long Island, New York, or I like to say that the territory is Shinnecock and Southampton is located on Shinnecock territory. So we're far east of Long Island, which is in New York. Our ancestors actually were the first ones to greet the settlers that came to the shores of New York. When Henry Hudson sailed past Long Island, he mentioned that he'd seen the Shinnecock people on the shores. And I'm very proud to say that we still live and hold our territory on those same exact shores. So I have been appointed to be the managing director, CEO of our tribe's cannabis business. And it's really exciting times for us because even though I may have started with the history side, we've endured a lot of different kind of things, just like any person of color in this country. We've endured a lot, and we still endure a lot. And the most important thing is that we are able to be economically sustainable as a nation, just as we always have been when it comes to sustainability for our lives and the environment. And so economically, we're pushing the same thing. So I'm a leader, a business leader in our community.
Yeah, that's amazing. So can you share with people who are tuning in and maybe for the first time are hearing some of these different terms, nation or even cannabis community in terms of the Shinnecock tribe, what opportunities do you see to bridge the Native community with other communities of color as it relates to social equity in cannabis? And why is that important for anyone who may be unfamiliar with like what we're discussing?
So we'll start with the term. So the term Native American federally recognized tribe is essentially what the Shinnecock Nation is, right? So there's different classifications or different categories that the government sees tribes in. Some are quote unquote historically recognized, meaning like on paper they don't exist, but they actually exist. And then the state might recognize the tribe, but the federal government doesn't. And then you might have a federally recognized tribe that is kind of within the I don't want to say jurisdiction, but the geographical location of the state. And they supersede the state, which is why sometimes we're able to go about particular things such as cannabis on our own without needing a license from the state, right? So that's what makes Shinnecock very uniquely different. So when it comes to how can we work with, or what type of conversations can we begin to have, or should we have already been having with people of color in the industry, is that the Shinnecock Nation is a government. We're not a social equity group or community, right? That essentially has to benefit from the programs that the state creates, because we don't benefit from those programs, even though we kind of can be classified as a social equity group. We don't benefit from the programs, right? Because we're a separate government, a separate entity. So with that being said, there is opportunity for people of color to do business with not only just Little Beach Harvest or the or our project, but other areas of business within the nation, right? And there's a lot of different ways about being able to go with that. I mean, whether that is different brands, right? Brand partnerships, whether you have a security firm an IT company, a media company, all of these different kinds of things. Because when you're talking about industry, you're talking about every area of business that the industry needs, right, to thrive. And so if people of color meet all those different areas, why not explore what that type of relationship can be with Native American tribes? And so I guess I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I love that. First of all, to share with this audience and just people in general that you are self-governed. I think that is such a powerful reality that you have the opportunity to experience as a leader in the Shinnecock Nation. And I don't think people really fully understand what that means and how that differs from our experience. And with existing government organizations, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, to say this is how you can consume and or deal and trade with cannabis, I think it's really important that you explain that delineation to us. So thank you for sharing that. Now, with that, can you explain what does it mean to be sovereign or not governed federally? And what does that allow you to do in terms of how you're moving in the cannabis industry and moving that business forward for the tribe?
Okay, yes. So when we're talking about like how we're sovereign, it's important to note like the historical content of it, right? So specifically Shinnecock, and I'll say Shinnecock, but really all of the tribes along the coastline. And the reason why I say coastline is because we were the first contacted. So we were contacted by the French, the German, the Spanish, the English. A lot of people always think about the English colonists. So a lot of the treaties that were held along the East Coast were held with those particular governments. So they were government to government relationships via treaty that was had. And since then, you've had a lot of the tribes on the East Coast that have still governed themselves based upon those treaties. And since then, you've had the American government, the North and the South, the different states, the different small hamlets and the towns, Southampton being one of the oldest settlement of New York, so 1640, but that's older than the state of New York. So fast forward into today, we still hold that sovereign space as a government, right? And we govern ourselves based upon our traditions and our culture and our understanding and our ways, and we still do that. So that's drastically different than the state of New York. That's drastically different than the United States. This isn't something that they sort of, I will say, inherited that supposedly relationship from the crown of England, but they may not have always upheld that relationship. So when you have citizens of the United States, through their educational system, through media, through wherever you see a Native, that piece of education isn't really put out there. So when people think about Native people, they don't really understand that we actually have governments, you know?
Yeah. So then, okay, we are seeing all of these different social equity programs, initiatives rolling out in states where cannabis has become legal. And what you're explaining to our audience is that you're a self-governing community and nation. So like when you think about social equity programming, or you think about really just bringing more equity to the cannabis space, how is the Shinnecock Nation thinking about just measuring success in terms of the cannabis space and building communities? Like, what can we learn from the Shinnecock Nation that maybe we can adopt for some of these other programs that we're seeing rolling out in different states that may be missing the mark in terms of social equity for cannabis?
So in terms of social equity for we can say cannabis, but almost any industry. So indigenous people, we hold tenure about 80% of the global biodiversity of the world, right?
Wow.
We hold tenure over that. We have a big responsibility to that. We make up about 2.5, less than 2.5 of the human population, right? So that's a lot of responsibility on indigenous people. And if we live in the Hamptons, and we are a part of that small 2%, and we live on the on the ocean side that we have kept clean. We have the best quahog shells. Our water is actually kind of probably a lot more clear than other parts of Long Island. We still have the vegetation that grows around there. And, we do what we need to do to sustain ourselves through the environment, right? But if we don't have the financial means of doing so, people get sick. We can get deep into criminal justice reform, the prison to pipeline. We're not exempt from that. Whether that starts in kindergarten and all the way up until you graduate school, there's a record that is kept. There are a lot of things that we suffer from as well. But if we don't have the proper funding or the proper resources, then we're not able to do that. So speaking to how does this cannabis business benefit us? It's going to generate revenue that's going to create not only just jobs, but careers for people. You're going to have people that are very well into understanding the environment that can now utilize cannabis and hemp to be able to do so on our territory with the proper education, right?
Yeah.
Being able to put other people like myself as a CEO, a female CEO of a cannabis business, who I think there's only 8% of us in the entire industry. And I make up a very slither of the Native American CEOs in this type of industry. Now we're able to empower our people, because once you empower them, then the mental health, right, begins to be healed. So there's so many different ways that we, despite whether we're going to receive anything from the state or not, we're doing that within our own community. And so I think that what I could say is that if that is some sort of a model for people to do within their own community, because every community has their own unique needs. You know what I'm saying? Whether you live in Baltimore, whether you live somewhere up in the Berkshires, whether you live on a reservation, whether you live on a horse farm, your specific needs are going to be specific to that community. And figuring out what those are, and then figuring out what programs are you going to need, and then working with the communities alongside of you and figuring out what is that larger picture. What we're finding is that we're not being contacted really from other social equity groups sometimes to be a part of the larger ask. Yes, it's kind of like, give us your example or things like that, but not like, here, sit at the table. These are the things that we're going to be communicating. Where is your voice? We're not kind of getting that. And, I'm not complaining about it, but I think it's imperative for people to realize, once again, if we hold tenure over 80% of the global biodiversity, that clean water that we're standing in front of bulldozers to fight for is what we all have to drink. And so leaving indigenous people out of that conversation isn't something that we need to be able to do. And we're always trying to be as inclusive as we can. But again, we've kind of had a common oppressor. And so I think it's really sitting down and being able to educate each other on the history, and specifically hearing from us a lot more as indigenous people in that area. I think that's going to help all around, because we're talking about a sacred plant. We're talking about a plant that actually brings peace to one another, something that we have been utilizing to be able to show that.
Yeah. So Chenae, I love that. And I feel like it kind of takes me back to the fall. One of the things we talked about when you joined our panel in September was creating circular economies, and how do we think of everyone being a part of this equation for equity. And, I think that there is a lot of pervasive rhetoric or narrative around how has the plant impacted Black and Brown people, but we haven't really talked about Native communities and how not only do you have like a model or a playbook, right, for what that can look like as a sovereign nation and self-governing body, but how do we all sit around the table and have these conversations together? And I think having the opportunity to hear you speak about that and speak about just representing your community in the way that you do has always been eye-opening for me. And I'm really, really happy that we're able to have this conversation and have this dialogue on this platform for people to hear it for themselves. So then in the way of education, because you mentioned people needing to really educate themselves on like, what could that look like? How can people educate themselves more on the Native communities in the states where they live? So if you live up and down the East Coast and you probably are in a territory or an area where a nation exists and is self-governing. How can you educate yourselves on who those communities are, connect with them, and collaborate in a way that's going to be more actionable and meaningful?
I love that question because I'm a big call to action type of person.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I'm big on going beyond land acknowledgement. That's one of the things that I speak about. And one of my other hats is going beyond land acknowledgement, because everybody likes to acknowledge the land that they're on. Right now I'm calling in from the traditional homelands of the Muskogee people. I'm not on Shinnecock territory. I'm on Muskogee Creek lands. And it's imperative that we do that because it's a living land acknowledgement, because the people still exist. So if you're driving through, if you're going to Maryland and you're passing by the Susquehanna River, you need to know that the people still exist there. If you're going through anywhere in Long Island, almost all of the names are indigenous names: Canarsie, Ronkonkoma, Maroke, Massapequa, Shinnecock, Montauk, Hackensack, Wappinger. All of these are different names that are people that actually still exist. And so I think following those names will get you to the people that still exist. But there's a way to research it. You literally could just see what tribes are recognized in your state, right? There will be federally recognized tribes. Some states like Georgia do not have federally recognized tribes. I think it's one of the only maybe Delaware. Actually, no, not Delaware. They do have tribes, but they're not physically in Delaware. But at least in Georgia, there are no recognized tribes, federally recognized tribes here, but you still have state recognized tribes. And so once you can kind of see what those tribes are, most of those tribes have websites, they have powwows, they have gatherings, they have protests, they have rallies, they are fighting for clean water, they're fighting for against pipelines sometimes, they're fighting for inclusion in the cannabis industry. So there's different ways to be able to go about that. But after saying that piece, I think it's imperative specifically for people of color to understand that you would now be trying to create a relationship with a community or a people that have had relationships that have been pretend. So right away, it's not going to be like, yeah, come on over and sit down by our fire and learn how to cook, I don't know, bluefish or whatever. Learn how to sing and drum and learn how we grow our cannabis. We're not going to be necessarily that open after 400 years, right? So it's going to take some time to build relationships. So I always say, make that relationship with the individuals of that community if you can. Understand their specific story, their clan story, their family story. And from there, when the community starts to see that pure intention, there's a different, larger relationship that can be had. And I think that there's always just we want to know. So can we just show up to Shinnecock? And I'm like, it's not a zoo. It's definitely not a zoo. It's not a walk. It's not a park. So I think just building those relationships, but recognizing that the land that you're on, no matter where you are, especially if you're on Turtle Island, you're on native land. It's a matter of figuring out what native land, have those natives been removed? And if they are, that doesn't mean that they're not still spiritually connected to the place that you're on. And that also doesn't mean that their government still has jurisdiction over the area that you're on. So there's, I think that's just my viewpoint in developing relationships with natives.
Yeah, I love that. So last thing is, if you want to leave us with any just like thought leadership or guiding principles for women, people of color, anyone in this space that is really trying to move the challenges forward. There's a lot happening, and I think we've heard a lot, everything from policy to social equity to understanding ancillary services, as you mentioned earlier with some of the career opportunities. There's a lot happening in the cannabis space right now, and I think people are just trying to get their arms around like what's happening. What do you want to leave us with? What do you want women to know? What do you want Black and brown people, Native people to know about how we should all move forward with this opportunity that we have in front of us?
Well, since I will be addressing the audience is the people that you just said, I would say, let's end lateral violence, period. Like, I think that's, I'm not going to beat around the bush with that. And I think everybody can understand, because they've either have practiced lateral violence or have been a victim of lateral violence. And if we're talking about being left out, that is the biggest reason why. Because we're not united. And so ending lateral violence and really, really, really practicing the inclusion that we're asking for within our movement, and stop thinking that it has to be one of us, because it can be all of us. And that's what I would say, because it is really the environment that is solely being impacted, the air quality, the atmospheric energy, the ocean sustainability, all of these different types of things. Those are billion, trillion dollar industries, okay? And so if you're talking about indigenous people who have a stake in that industry by inheritance, we have to at least have $1 to put into that. And so that's where it's gonna take us building some of these smaller industries to get to that $1 trillion, so that we can sustain that. And so it's gonna take us all kind of coming together. And so that's what I would say for women, young women, young people of color, people that might be introverts. Don't be afraid to stand up and speak about the pink elephant in the room, but do it as graceful and from a place of love. You know what I'm saying? Because sometimes being a victim of lateral violence in any way, shape, or form, especially in any industry, there's cliques, there's relationships, there's all those kinds of things. This is not that kind of industry. This is a medicine industry. This is a actual natural healing industry. It's not meant to we're not meant to bring all of that we've experienced into this place. So I would say, if anything, let's work together to be able to really take it to a whole nother level.
I love it. So for anyone who wants to get in contact with you or learn more about the Shinnecock Nation or what you're doing at Little Beach Harvest, give us your handles, give us your contact.
So you could literally go to Twitter, Instagram, or the website, even Facebook, and just type in Little Beach Harvest. Little Beach Harvest. So that's at Little Beach Harvest. That's www.littlebeachharvest.com. You can find that anywhere. And then from there, you can also find me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us today, Chenae. It's always a pleasure to connect with you, to learn from you, and to really just understand the experience that you're living as a self-governing nation, and just all of the power and sense of responsibility that comes with that. It's really incredible. So thank you for sharing.
Yes, and thank you for empowering us women.